atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, attorney and former deputy assistant to President Trump, May Mailman.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, May, how are you doing this morning?
I am great. How are you?
I'm doing okay, too, actually. So looking forward to a family vacation I'm getting ready to go off on. So that'll be good. Our dogs feel a little less enthusiastic about it, though they like our house sitter. So that's something. But, anyway, but before we do leave, we have so much to talk about. It's been another big week. We want to get into the Hunter Biden verdict, the big Supreme Court ruling on Mifepristone, on bump stocks. There's a ton of stuff. Though before I do get into that, I do want to make sure I thank our newest supporter on Patreon, Jake. Jake, thank you so much for helping us do what we do. And also, I want to mention that, of course, we are fans of democracy here on The Politics Guys, though, sometimes I have my doubts, but I can happily recommend the show Democracy Works. It's a great podcast. They look at what it means to live in a democracy. Recent episodes go into things like how elected strongmen weaken democracy, political protests, the struggling democracy in South Africa, a bunch of other things. It's a great show. Highly recommend it. And also, of course, I'll put in a plug for my other podcast, Sustainable Planet. The latest episode, Kimberly and I talk about avocados. I love avocados, but they are rough on the environment. And believe it or not, they're actually linked in a big way to Mexican drug cartels. So yes, that avocado toast you're eating may be helping to indirectly support a drug cartel. Go figure. Anyway, want to hear more about that? Check it out. And also, you might want to check out the new Sustainable Planet Substack. I know a lot of people, you're out of bandwidth to add another podcast into your lineup. It for sure feels like me. But if you want to check out the Substack, a little less time-consuming dose of all sorts of good sustainability-related stuff. This week's entry was Imagine Life Without Restaurants. And you can check that out at splanetpod.substack.com, or I'll just, put the links in the show notes for that. For Sustainable Planet, for Democracy Works, so much good stuff. All highly recommend. All right. So, May, I heard there was something involving Hunter Biden this week.
All right. So I guess the verdict that some people have been waiting for, Hunter Biden was found guilty of various federal gun charges, lying on a background check form, and then possessing a gun while addicted to or using illegal drugs. The sentencing hasn't occurred yet, won't occur for a little while. So what we know right now is that he's guilty, but there's been no sort of punishment assigned, although he could face up to 25 years and a fine of up to $750,000. Both of those are unlikely because he's a first-time offender. So I guess a couple of, things to note here, which some of the jurors have spoken out. They said it was not unanimous at first. They had some discussion, but ultimately it did not take them a very long time to come up with a guilty verdict. And it was really hard to get around the fact that he was guilty. I mean, all of the evidence showed that he was addicted to drugs and that he lied on this form. And so there was just no way around it. And then I think the other thing is what's been the commentary. So if you look on MSNBC, the headline is Hunter Biden verdict undermines Republican conspiracy theories about a two-tiered system of justice, right? This shows that the system works and no one is above the law. And then if you look on Fox News, I guess one headline is social media erupts over Hunter Biden guilty verdict, covers the Biden family's real crimes. That is, we are distracted by this. Oh, he was found guilty of this gun crime, therefore no one is above the law. Okay, but let's remember how we got here. there was a plea deal offered that Hunter Biden rejected. He wanted, apparently, to go to trial here because he had a plea deal where he didn't have to. And that this seems to be acceptable to him because he's not being charged with things like the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which would implicate, hey, you were receiving bags of cash from foreign entities, and you were presumably talking to your father about that. A, why weren't you registered as representing these foreign entities? And B, what went on there? What was your father receiving money? Was your father knowing that you were receiving money and he was taking these meetings so that you were? That whole angle, that has nothing to do with these gun charges. And so I think the right is a little bit, trying to say, don't be distracted by this gun charge. Hunter wanted to go on this gun charge. He had a plea deal and didn't take it. So then I guess third angle is, how does this affect the election? My sense is that it is irrelevant, but we'll see. So, Mike, does this show that nobody is above the law?
I don't know if anyone's above the law, but certainly there are some people who can get away with more than other people. It seemed to me that the defense was almost comical. And my understanding is it was essentially that, well, sure, he was a drug addict, but you can't prove he was a drug addict during and taking drugs during that particular, 2.5 week period where he had the gun and applied for it. And so that blew up in their face. I understand the sort of, I won't even call it a conspiratorial viewpoint, but one way you can look at this is to say, well, why, and this is what I was thinking at first, why in the world would Hunter Biden decide to go to trial with this when it seemed so obvious that what the result was going to be? But of course, then people might say, well, his dad can just pardon him. There are, these are federal charges. Now, earlier, but before the verdict, I believe it was, President Biden said to one media outlet that he wouldn't pardon him. But later on, then the White House didn't exactly walk those remarks back, but they said that, well, he wasn't ruling out a commutation. And so I think there's the narrative you can put together saying that he thought, well, let's roll the dice, see what happens. Maybe I get a sympathetic juror. But in the end, I'm not really going to serve any time because at the end of his term, my dad can just commute my sentence. And I don't think that's an entirely unreasonable thing because after all, the White House press secretary said a commutation wasn't off the table. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Do you think that the Hunter Biden will end up serving any time, or do you think his sentence will be commuted, or what's your sense of how this is going to play out?
I just don't get the sense that he's going to face any time to begin with. There will be nothing to commute. I don't know. If you look at sentencing, he doesn't, at least facially, appear to be still addicted to drugs and possessing firearms. There's no need to put him in jail in order to sort of change his lifestyle or protect the public. The punishment of sort of the whole world knowing what you did and shaming you for it has already occurred. I don't see a judge really feeling that prison time is necessary here. Obviously, although in theory, if the Biden administration is all about safe gun use and reducing gun use, then in theory, the Department of Justice should seek the high end of possible sentence ranges for gun crimes. But if I doubt that that's going to be the case here. So I don't see anything to commute. And, how would that look politically? Let's just say Hunter Biden is sentenced to 30 days, 45 days, I don't know, something minor, even half a year, something like that. And would it be worth for Democrats for forever to be charged with favoritism in this way, which will be used politically against them, even when you're not talking about Joe Biden, just when you're talking about how the justice system works. I just don't think that that's worth it. I think you just, okay, Hunter, you are very guilty here. You just serve your time. I don't think commutation would be a wise political move.
Yeah, and actually, I agree with that, but I felt it was important to put out that narrative and bring that up because, of course, I have been seeing that in various places. But yeah, I think that seems a lot more sensible to my view, and more or less what will happen. But of course, there's still that federal tax trial for I think it's scheduled to start in September for his failing to pay something like $1.4, I think it is, $1 million in taxes. So Hunter Biden is not out of the legal woods yet. And,
No.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that other case is another, sort of slam dunk case where the facts are just not on Hunter Biden's side, and it's been paused a little bit. But I think if you've got a jury that's honest, it's going to be another guilty verdict. That said, I guess the real problem was that we heard from the IRS whistleblowers is the IRS was not allowed to follow the money. So you're receiving all this money. You have basically no accounting practices. You're not reporting this as income to the federal government. A lot of it is held up in, cash and where did it go? Let's follow that. And that was what the IRS was not permitted to do per the whistleblowers that they found was very weird. And so, yes, you have these gun charges, which are unrelated to that. And now you have the tax charges, which are related to the bags of cash. But I still think there's a frustration on the right of these are not the trials that Americans care about. What we care about is, was there foreign influence over the vice president, and did it affect decision making? Those are the questions that I just don't think you're going to get answers in these trials. And so it's sort of like, we don't care.
Yeah. And my thinking on that is unsurprisingly a lot different. I feel that Republicans in the House have done their darndest to try to make something out of what's essentially nothing. And I understand their frustration that they can't find enough, but I just think that is just an enormous nothing burger. I'm not saying that Hunter Biden isn't a troubled guy who's been involved in some sketchy stuff, but this whole idea of the Biden crime family just makes me roll my eyes. But I understand it politically, and I also think that politically, this is at least a small disappointment for the right, because certainly an acquittal would make that argument about there's this, what's it called, lawfare that's being done essentially. But again, I think that was fairly unlikely to happen in the first place, because as you pointed out, Hunter Biden was certainly looked very, very, very guilty. So, and one other thing I wanted to mention was the responses, because there's some interesting things here. I think Joe Biden's comment was, I'll accept the outcome, respect the judicial process, and so trying to, I think, use that to say, hey, look who respects the judicial process when it goes against him, and look who doesn't when everything. I don't know that there's ever been a verdict that's gone against Donald Trump where he hasn't said it was not only wrong but rigged. But so there's that. But also, there's been this interesting thing about initially it was not reported, but there was this story on social media that Donald Trump said, oh, I'm going to save your son after I get elected. Don't worry about it, Joe, that kind of thing. And that turned out to be fake news, this bizarro fake quote. And the actual Trump response, aside from this distracts us from the real crimes of the Biden crime family, and that's a quote, Donald Trump went on Fox News, and actually it was a very, I think, sympathetic response. He said, he understands it because, of course, his brother died of alcoholism, and he said it's a tough situation for a family, and it's really difficult for any family to go through. So, at least a moment of empathy from Donald Trump there.
Yeah. So on the sort of the Biden versus Trump response, as far as like accepting the verdict, I just, you just can't compare apples and oranges, I think. Here, this is a crime that is charged every single day in jurisdictions across the country, lying on a gun form, possessing and using weapons while under the influence. Like, this is standard stuff. Usually, yes, it is charged as part of a bucket of things. You have 10 crimes, and this is, 4 of those 10. But it is not a weird thing to charge. And the evidence was so overwhelming, it was almost impossible to get around. I didn't know what his lawyer was going to say. And yeah, they wanted to go with, you don't know that he was not using it like literally as he was checking the box, like during that second were you under the influence. Like that's not the law. And so when you're asked to comment on this type of thing, it would be completely odd to say this, we do not accept this is rigged. I mean, no, it's not. This is not a weird law. This is a very obvious sort of ask for the jury versus let's just take the recent Alvin Bragg case where you've got a law that has never been used in this manner. So to use a federal election law as the predicate crime for a state charge like this, falsifying document, like completely novel in every way, where you have a judge who did donate to President Biden and to other Democrat entities, not at huge levels, but clearly is conflicted in that manner, where you have your prime witness to testify about what federal election law means, unable to testify, where you have a jury pool pulled in a jurisdiction that votes 85% Democrat. I mean, it's just to say, oh, you know what? I accept that. No one, justice was served is a lot harder in that second instance than it is in the first instance. So I guess I don't know. I can't compare the two because in my opinion, they are not comparable.
Well, I unsurprisingly take issue with a lot of the assertions that you made about the factual basis of many of those things. But I mean, we don't want to get into sort of rediscussing or relitigating that. But I think what I'll say is that it's possible to say, well, I respect the judicial system, though I disagree with this outcome. And so you can put forward, say, I believe we have strong grounds for appeal, like, for instance, the jury pool issue or various other things or bias on the case of the judge. But you don't have to. And it's not like this is an isolated incident. Again, if someone can point out to me, and listeners, if you can, please do, a single instance in which something of significance went against Donald Trump and he took the blame for that, I'd sure like to know about it, because as far as I know, that would be unique. And so either Donald Trump is a man completely without flaw, a perfect human being who deserves the golden statue that was erected to him a few years ago, or this is just, part and parcel of how Donald Trump operates, and he's never wrong about anything, which is, kind of troubling to me there. But anyway, any other thoughts on the Hunter Biden verdict before we move on?
Only that it will be forgotten in our memory, I think, pretty soon.
Yeah, I think you're right about that for sure. All right, well, let's move on to something that maybe won't be forgotten quite as quickly in our memory. A fairly significant, though maybe less than what it seems, Supreme Court ruling. Late this week, they unanimously ruled against pro-life doctors who challenged the FDA's decisions expanding access to the abortion drug Mifepristone in 2016 and then again in 2021, finding that the plaintiffs lacked standing to challenge the FDA's action. And in his opinion for the court, Justice Kavanaugh, I love this, referred back to the late Justice Scalia's great test for standing, which is, what's it to you? And he concluded that, well, the sort of convoluted argument that the doctors put forward is, in Kavanaugh's words, too speculative or otherwise too attenuated to establish standing. And in the decision, in opinion, Kavanaugh points out that not only do the doctors not have to prescribe mifepristone, but federal conscience laws protect them from performing emergency abortions or other procedures in patients who have taken mifepristone and have complications they need to be treated for. And Kavanaugh really went, I think, hard to emphasize the importance of standing. He wrote that the requirement that the plaintiffs possess a personal stake helps ensure that courts decide litigants' legal rights in specific cases, as Article 3 requires, and that courts do not opine on legal issues in response to citizens who might, I love this line, roam the country in search of governmental wrongdoing, which I know sounds kind of cool to me. But anyway, May, what did you think about this unanimous Supreme Court decision?
I was always a little hesitant on the merits of this case, whether the FDA properly promulgated various rules, loosening requirements, making chemical abortion drugs more available. Agencies have a lot of free reign. And so I kind of thought that's really where this case is. Standing, I don't love that. And full disclosure, I did not get an A in federal courts in law school because I hated standing so much then. I reject that there is any sense to it. So the idea of standing is that in order to bring a charge in federal court, that you have to be injured in some way and seek a remedy through the courts. Okay, that makes sense, sort of. But there have been so many decisions blowing that idea up that I just don't think it's real anymore. And unfortunately, I think that there's a sort of a disparate way that this is treated depending on who's bringing the charge. So, for example, the state of Massachusetts wanted to challenge the failure of an agency to promulgate various environmental rules because Massachusetts said that the failure to timely pass these environmental rules creates more global warming, and that when there's more global warming, that affects Massachusetts because Massachusetts has some land and that land will have more water on it than otherwise. I'm sorry.
Talk about too attenuated to establish standing. Yeah, that's, I would say, yeah.
What? Like, you have not tied this rule that you're asking for to the injury that is occurring to you. And the Supreme Court said, that's true. That's true. We have no way of linking this governmental decision to like inches of coastline lost. However, because the injury is so great, we're going to kind of forget about that. What? So there have been all these invented rules for standing when it comes to liberal plaintiffs. Another example, abortion doctors. The Roe versus Wade right goes to the woman. Women had a constitutional right to abortion. Of course, they never really had a constitutional right to abortion, but whatever. Okay. And women were never the ones bringing the case. It was always doctors' associations. Well, doctors don't have a right to do abortions. Like, that's not a constitutional right, but they were always bringing it because they were sort of regulated. So in that sense, they were regulated here, but they don't have the right. So I have always felt as though there is a split here where conservatives can't bring cases, for example, when migrants are crossing the border and not being arrested, and those are causing increased harms to the state. The state now has to dedicate more resources because there are more illegal migrants. That's not enough. That's not enough. But look at the global warming decision. And so here again, I just feel like, yeah, maybe these doctors are not directly regulated. And so, yes, maybe their standing is a little bit attenuated, but I do not feel as though their standing is more attenuated than abortion doctors or more attenuated than the state of Massachusetts for the EPA to pass regulations. And so while in theory, I don't mind this decision, I just hope that at some point in my lifetime, standing becomes even on both sides.
I understand what you're saying. I would be hesitant to agree with your contention that these sort of issues affect liberal more than conservative causes without seeing some data on that. I mean, you pull out some instances, but I think in the end, I feel this argument of, well, let's just forget about standing to even the scales is just more or less, I think, fairly wrong-headed. And here, this is going to sound weird, maybe to some people, but I think that Justice Thomas, he wrote a concurrence, not to say that he didn't agree with the decision. He said he agreed pretty much wholly with the decision, but he said, hey, where does this associational standing thing even come from in the first place? And so what Thomas would do was he would kind of, I think, even it out in the way you would like, and a lot of people would like, by saying, we should actually be looking at associational standing, which shouldn't be a thing, because as far as Thomas is concerned, it's just like third-party standing, and there's nothing in the Constitution that suggests that should be a thing. And so that's how Justice Thomas would even it up and just say, hey, the court shouldn't hear any of this stuff if it's associational. And I got to say, I disagree with Clarence Thomas on a lot, I think ideologically, but I think he made a pretty good case in his brief concurrence here.
I think that's right. And conservatives are, I think, shifting on how at least, I don't know, conservative legal movement broadly views standing, because at first, I think conservatives in general wanted really tight standing rules, because most of these advocacy organizations that say, oh, because some individual might be harmed, therefore me as an association is harmed because I as a do-gooder organization help that individual. So when I have to help that individual, then I as an association is harmed. That is in general a sort of lefty thing. And like I said, the Massachusetts environmental, it tended to be that standing was viewed as weaponized by the left, the Sierra Club, liberal states, to get around the democratic process. So, we want tight standing rules. I think there's been a shift where it's, you know what? We can create, if the ACLU and the Sierra Club can do it, then we will have, associations of pro-life doctors, conservative attorneys general, groups on the right do the opposite. And so you've seen litigation against the Title IX rule. There are 9 cases already. I mean, the student loan, the vaccine mandate, all of these big Biden policies are immediately, within seconds of being promulgated, being challenged by the right. So I think now conservatives are split. Some people still want the whole thing to go away. And others are, this is where we are now. We are in a place where standing is broad. And so we would like to be given the benefit of that doubt too. And I probably, I don't know. I think I'm on the latter half where let's just open up the floodgates, because I just think that's where we are.
I hear you. I think I'm with Clarence Thomas on this one. So, and I'm not saying that because I'm angling for a trip on Harlan Crow's yacht or anything like that. I think he's just right on this, but I think you're right in a sort of a practical sense, and that maybe that ship has already sailed, and this is yet another one of Clarence Thomas's sort of lonely crusades that's not going to go anywhere. But, if we turn to the merits of this, one of the questions I asked myself was, well, this is a unanimous court here. And so I wanted to think, well, how did the Fifth Circuit ever see these things differently? And I looked back to the Fifth Circuit decision, not about just the standing issue, but also about the merits. And you talked about that earlier. And I think you can maybe make some case. Well, I think there are two cases you can make. One is that, well, there are some arbitrary and capricious. They did not consider fully the medical effects, the increase in complications and all that. I think that's weak. What I think is a stronger case, and this is where apparently now my good friend Clarence Thomas would agree with me, is that I think the stronger case is actually a Comstock Act argument. And actually the Fifth Circuit points to that in their decision, because I know that the federal government has said, no, sending abortion drugs doesn't violate it as long as the drug is being used lawfully. But if you actually read the Comstock Act, it pretty much directly says you cannot use the Postal Service to send out any drug which is intended to abort a pregnancy. I mean, it literally says that. And so to me, that's a pretty strong argument that maybe a lot of people don't want to hear. But to me, on the merits, I think if conservatives can make a case fine standing, whether it's by a state, I think that's the direction they're looking at, or even a woman who's been prescribed one of these drugs and has had complications. I don't know. To me, that's a legal argument that I think has some legs, even though I don't know that a majority of the court would buy onto it. I certainly think that Thomas and Alito and maybe one or two other conservative justices. What do you think on that? Particularly, I'm interested in your thoughts on the Comstock Act part of it.
Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the ins and outs of the Comstock Act, which, as you say, is pretty straightforward. It's just basically dormant. That's, I think, the Comstock Act's problem, is that it's been violated blatantly for years. And so it feels like, I don't know, just the course of history has affected what the English language means there, which is sort of a thing in the law. But I guess the reason I haven't spent that much time thinking about it is, if conservatives were to press on the Comstock Act and really try and enforce it and say, listen, this is what the law says. You can't mail out abortion drugs, like not a difficult law to read. It would be very unpopular.
Yeah.
Because, most Americans are not at the 0 week, right? I think it's something like 8% of Americans are at the far restrictive end. Abortion should be illegal in every case. Most Americans are somewhere around 12 to 15 weeks. And so, that means you are in abortion drug land. And most Americans would not support having to, if you know that you are going to have an abortion, having to carry a baby for additional weeks so that you can have a surgical abortion. And I guess the idea is, surgical abortion is not permitted either. But in theory, if you're just relying on the Comstock Act, that's what you've got. You've got no abortion early, yes, abortion late. And that is such an unpopular decision, only late abortions, that I just don't think that the Comstock Act at this point really should be part of the vocabulary of conservatives, because there's a lot of other things that need to be done to respect women, to prevent unwanted pregnancies, to encourage people to respect unborn life. There are so many other things that do not involve the Comstock Act that I can't spend my brain power on the Comstock Act.
Yeah, I don't think it'll ever come to that. But there, like I said, there is that part of me that is sort of with Sam and Clarence in the trenches saying, but the law is there and it says this thing and you can't just ignore it because you want to ignore it. But I think that's what we sort of decided we're going to do. And the rest of the justices, I imagine, just kind of roll their eyes, just like, oh my God, there they go again, But yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right on that. So any other thoughts on this ruling? How maybe we haven't talked really about the political ramifications. I know there are some on the left who are saying, well, the conservative justices just ruled in this way to take the issue off the table before the elections. I've never been kind of in that camp either way. So I don't really put much stock into that. But generally speaking, I think politically, this is kind of just sort of keeps things in the status quo, basically, right?
That's right. I buy the fact that it's a dodge, that ruling on standing. I think it's correct that they didn't have to reach in the law to come up with this ruling. It was always standing was always a challenge, but not having to decide a very political case about abortion is probably good for the court at this point, right? To not be overcharged politically when you don't need to be. So sure, that's a dodge, I guess, and I think a reasonable one to have an abortion related decision that's unanimous, I think is a good thing for people trusting the court right now. I guess one of the I guess funny things is people like to say, yeah, the court rules unanimously sometimes, but not on the big cases. On the big cases, all the MAGA justices, it's 6-3, and all they care about is politics or whatever. And it's funny because when they rule unanimously, then all of a sudden the case becomes not a big case. So you can't win and show that actually, no, not every decision is just infused with politics, including the big ones. This was a big one and it was unanimous.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, it was a dodge, but it was the right call. Probably.
I agree. I think it was a dodge, but it was a correct dodge. Well, let's move on to another major Supreme Court ruling. On Friday, the Supreme Court invalidated an ATF rule banning bump stocks, which essentially make semi-automatic weapons automatic, at least in function. Now, the rule went into effect in 2018, and that followed that horrific Las Vegas mass shooting, 60 dead, 500 wounded. And after that, then President Donald Trump directed DOJ to dedicate, in his words, all available resources to putting a rule into effect that would ban bump stocks. And the decision on Friday was along the kind of standard 6-3 lines. The court's 6 conservatives ruled against the ban. The 3 Democrat-appointed justices were in dissent. Now, writing for the majority, Justice Thomas said that the question was whether a bump stock transforms a semi-automatic rifle into a machine gun as defined by federal law. And the majority finds that it doesn't. And they point out that prior to the Trump-era ATF rule, on more than 10 separate occasions over several administrations, the agency concluded the same thing. And actually, in the ruling, they go into a lot of detail on this. There are even multiple diagrams sort of showing all this stuff. And the law in question defines a machine gun as any weapon that's capable of firing automatically more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. And by that definition, the majority, again, with pictures, concluded that a bump stock does not, in fact, transform a semi-automatic weapon into a machine gun, which means that by banning bump stocks as machine guns, in effect, the ATF exceeded its statutory authority. Now, Thomas concludes that Congress could have passed legislation that designated weapons as machine guns based on something like their rate of fire, but it didn't do that. And so he ends by quoting Justice Gorsuch, actually, from an earlier opinion, saying, "It is never our job to rewrite statutory text under the banner of speculation about what Congress might have done." Now, Justice Alito wrote a short concurrence saying that, well, there's no other way to read this statutory language, and that there's a simple remedy for this. It's Congress can just amend the law. And he says, well, maybe they even would have done that if ATF had stuck with its earlier interpretation. And now that we've clarified the situation, Congress can act. The dissent was written by Justice Sotomayor, joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson. And Sotomayor writes, "When I see a bird that walks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, I call that bird a duck. A bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle fires automatically more than one shot without manual reloading by a single function of the trigger. And so, because I, like Congress, call that a machine gun, I respectfully dissent." So in other words, the dissenters are concluding that the majority is taking a sort of overly narrow view, ignoring a common sense understanding for a far too precise interpretation that undermines the very purpose of the law. So, May, what do you think about the decision and what this might lead to legislatively, whether at the state or the federal level?
Yeah, so I think it's funny because I was in the Trump White House when this regulation was passed, and I wasn't directly involved, but I remember a lot of the circumstance surrounding this, which is there were definitely people who felt that this is not the correct reading of the statute. So the way a bump stock works is it like bumps the gun so that you can really quickly pull the trigger multiple times. It goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So it might sort of look like a machine gun because you're able to rapidly fire. But I have heard that really skilled marksmen, whatever, gun users can simulate a bump stock themselves by the way that they sort of handle the gun. And that a machine gun, you have to literally just pull the trigger one time and it sprays like the movies that you see from the 20s, which is why machine guns are regulated by the National Firearms Act. And so, and yet there was this thinking that because even though it doesn't fit the definition of machine gun, because it transforms the gun to basically function as a machine gun, therefore, at least it's plausible. At least you can make the argument that the ATF can regulate bump stocks, but it was always a difficult argument, I think. And really, I think the question was, how much deference should the ATF be given? Because if it's not obvious, but it's potentially plausible, maybe, do the courts just throw up their hands and say, this does not seem correct to me, but fine, do what you're going to do. And I think that for a lot of history, since the Chevron decision, that's actually what courts have done, which courts have said, you know what, I'm not the expert in the National Firearms Act, or, I can read just like you can read, but you're the agency, you know better than me, you do it, do what you're going to do. And that is the least democratic thing ever, because it just no longer does the American public have the use of words to be able to constrain agencies and judges to be able to use those words to constrain the agencies. The public has nothing. And in theory, you can just vote for a new president. No, these agencies are not actually accountable to the president. There's just too many people. There's too many people doing too many things. And so I think that decisions like this that say, actually, I am a judge and I know how to read words. And when I read these words, a bump stock is not a machine gun. And so I'm not going to let a bump stock turn a rifle into a machine gun. I think that's the right move. And I think that that's where we're seeing this court go, which is judges know how to read, and it is democratic to be able to do that. So not a surprising decision. And I think in general, we're going to see more and more in this direction.
Yeah, I'm torn on this because on one hand, I feel like the proper place for these sort of decisions is with the democratic process. Laws should be passed. And of course, a number of states already have their own bans on bump stocks. California, New York, even Florida has a bump stock ban. And that's perfectly okay. And I would like to see a federal ban. And there's actually legislation that would do that. That's currently, it was introduced at the beginning of this session, and it basically went to committee and everyone said, we don't need to bother with this because the ATF essentially banned them. I think it's always better for legitimacy purposes if you can get something through Congress to do it that way. But I also think it's certainly plausible that the Trump administration, after the whole awful thing in Las Vegas, just said, listen, we need to do something, but we're not going to force a vote on Republicans in Congress because there are going to be people who are going to be very much against this. So we'll just do it through the ATF. It's legal enough. So, I mean, I think that was done for some political cover reasons, because even now, I don't necessarily expect a bump stock ban to pass in Congress, though there might be some supporters. And, you try to insulate your people from taking a vote that's going to get them in trouble. And so I think there's part of that. But I also feel like when I saw that decision, I'm looking at all these technical diagrams and I'm thinking, but this is exactly why Chevron can be important, because you have these justices all of a sudden becoming firearms regulation experts. And I would argue, I'm not saying you're wrong on this, but I also think that there's a point at which it just gets kind of ridiculous, and it's maybe less democratic to let these decisions rest with 9 unelected appointed for life justices than allow the administrative process, the procedures to work out. And so I don't know. I've got a lot of mixed feelings about this one, I guess. Well, one thing I do know is that I'm not a fan of bump stocks, and I certainly support any sort of legislatively enacted ban, though I don't see any of that coming, at least before certainly the elections.
Yeah, and I think that your feelings on bump stocks is generally shared. They're not a popular, especially after the Las Vegas shooting, they're not a popular device. And so I would expect to see states continue to regulate them. You have to sometimes be concerned about takings and things like that. Second Amendment, obviously, but yeah, having the ATF turn, that was some of what was happening here, is when you just have a regulation, you're turning law-abiding gun owners into felons overnight. I mean, all of a sudden you have something that has to be marked. It has to be, so with machine guns, there's a very difficult and expensive process that you need to do in order to have a gun that, falls in line with the National Firearms Act. So you just overnight turning people into unlawful gun owners, Hunter Biden style, I guess you could say. So that, I think, is just a really bad way to regulate people. When you are able to go through either a state legislative or congressional process, I don't know, I guess my sense is that you're able to take into consideration your own population and state by state figure out how are we going to pull these off the shelves and take them away from people who already own them in their home. I mean, this is a difficult thing versus just having a administrative agency say, now all you people are illegal.
I have some sympathy for that. And I think certainly you could imagine legislation written as with a buyback sort of, a buyback provision in there. So it's not like you mentioned takings and think, well, okay, I can see where somebody who, spent whatever money on a modification bump stock kit saying, well, now I have this thing that I spent whatever, hundreds of dollars on, and it's now, I'm just out because now it's illegal. So I would be sympathetic for that. And I would actually argue that in some ways it could be seen as a positive thing for the right, saying, hey, we're not just saying people should be running around with machine guns and rocket launchers and what have you. And look, here's some reasonable legislation that respects people's property rights, fairly compensates them, and also says, hey, we have some concerns about public safety. And that to me would be a really positive sort of thing, though I don't know that I would expect anything like that out of Congress at any point soon.
Yeah. But yeah, and even if Congress doesn't act, states are, I think, putting more decisions in the states is always a good thing, because that's actually where people are able to speak. I mean, it is possible to talk to your state legislator. It is basically impossible to talk to your congressman.
Right. But I guess I also think that if Congress intended, and they certainly did, as you mentioned with the whole thing with the why the Firearms Act was passed, right? We don't want people walking around with machine guns, essentially. And what we mean by machine guns in a common sense term is that weapons that can allow a normal, ordinary person, not an expert, to just fire a whole bunch of rounds really quick. And I think there's a really strong public safety, a strong, compelling governmental interest in that, right? And so if the federal government sees fit to ban machine guns and has for nearly a century, or not ban, but really restrict access in a major way, then I think it's reasonable to say, well, why not with this newer technology? And so that's why I think, while in general, I understand the argument for allowing states to decide, basically it seems to me that a small alterations to the Firearms Act that takes into account new technology would be entirely consistent with the historical understanding and interpretation of the Firearms Act and the reason for banning machine guns in the first place.
Yeah, maybe so. I guess machine guns, as I understand it, were super problematic in the 20s and early 30s. I mean, you had gangsters running amok with machine guns, and there was a necessary response at the federal level. Bump stocks are already fairly regulated at the state level. I don't get the sense that like our communities are being terrorized by gangsters. Obviously, yes, Las Vegas happened. There are a lot of things that need to happen to prevent a Las Vegas from happening again. But it's, I see different historical circumstances surrounding machine guns than surrounding bump stocks. And so I do feel as though the opportunity, it just feels different. But yeah, updating laws is never a bad thing. And to the extent that bump stocks are posing a risk to our communities, which obviously they are, then Congress should do its job. I have no faith in Congress doing its job. I do understand why the ATF acted here, obviously. But we can't just continue to say Congress sucks at its job, and so someone else is going to do it for you.
There you go. Whether it's an agency or the courts. Yeah, I'm with you on that. Before we go, I do feel like we should mention that people might not realize it, but there were elections this week. I mean, the primary season is most of the drama's gotten sucked out of it, right? Once Donald Trump became the presumptive nominee. But there have been some elections. I mean, there continue to be elections. Voters in the 5 states last week went to the polls. Most of them were uneventful, but there were some things I think worth pointing out. 2, I'll mention, is that 1, it seems like Kevin McCarthy doesn't have a whole lot of pull with California Republicans, or at least not primary voters, right? Because former Speaker McCarthy, hoping he could knock off Nancy Mace, who was one of those Republicans who forced him out of the speakership. But despite his best efforts and millions of dollars in spending, Mace just demolished McCarthy-backed Catherine Templeton by something like almost 30 points. And then there's also, I think, worth mentioning the Donald Trump's endorsees. Everyone Donald Trump endorsed has won last week. And not only that, but if you take a look at Donald Trump's overall primary endorsement record in this cycle, in my calculation, he's 4 of 4 in governor's races, 8 of 9 in Senate races, and I believe I have this right, a perfect 62 of 62 so far in House races. So, which suggests to me either he's gotten a lot smarter about who he endorses, a lot more strategic, or maybe these aren't mutually exclusive. He has a stronger than ever hold on a super Trumpy Republican primary election. So those are my 2 big things I took away from these elections on Tuesday. What do you think, May?
Yeah, so I think Trump is being more cautious and more last minute. So a lot of his endorsements don't mean anything because by the point he endorses, the candidate was already going to win anyway. But that's not a stupid way to go about doing things. No. You want your candidate to win. And so you want to make sure you're picking somebody who's capable of winning. And sometimes you wait till they basically already won. but that's certainly not been his path before, where he was picking people who had been the nicest to him for the longest period of time. And so I think it shows much better like political decision making, and that's a good thing for me. So I like good political decision making from Republican candidates. The thing that concerns me, I guess, is the Ohio 6th district, where the Republicans should have won by 20 to 30 points because it's a huge Republican advantage district. And yet it was the Republicans still won, but it was only by 10 points. So 10 points is still a lot, but I guess it's concerning not because people were out there voting Democrat, but Republicans just didn't show up. It was an incredibly, incredibly low turnout election. And that's not, so on one hand, maybe it means nothing. This was a random day where people were not expecting to vote. It didn't seem worthwhile for them to vote because they are in such a red district. Why would you go show up to something that's inevitable? Your vote essentially doesn't matter. You know who's going to win anyway. So maybe it just really has no signs for the general election. But if you look at the George Santos seat, where obviously it used to be red, it went blue. Here you've got a district that's super red, and now it's just very red. Potentially, there's, for me, a couple of things. One, it could be like sort of Hillary Clinton 2016 effect, where everybody knew that Hillary Clinton was going to win. So people just didn't vote. Democrats didn't vote. Maybe people are feeling that way on the right a little bit, and that's a dangerous thing. Another option is the electorate is flipping a little bit, which is not college educated voters are now favoring Republicans, to greater extents. So it used to be that sort of more educated voters were Republican. And so you would see, so they just show up to vote more often. But now that there's a flip, maybe the more educated voters are showing up for Democrats. And so what does that, how does low turnout affect how races are going to go? It used to be that low turnout elections generally favored Republicans. And then also just energy. Are Democrats more energized against MAGA as a thing, undefinable thing? And is that energy going to carry a very lackluster presidential candidate? That where's the energy in this race? It's about defeating MAGAism. And you can see that, I think, with a lot of ads just portraying MAGAism as dark and sinister. And it is, I think, very motivating for Democrats. So those are three thoughts on at least what I saw potentially in Ohio.
Yeah, I think on the Ohio thing and more general in Democrats overperforming Biden's 2020 numbers in special elections. Of course, as a Democrat, I'm pleased about that, but I don't put a lot of stock in it for some of the reasons that you kind of got into. I think a general election with higher turnout is going to be a different thing, especially when Joe Biden is on the ballot, because I think Joe Biden is a drag on the rest of the party. And I would expect almost every Democrat running for Congress is going to be a stronger candidate than Joe Biden, because Joe Biden is a remarkably weak presidential candidate. And so this doesn't really surprise me. I don't expect the Democrat overperformance to really, I'll say, I expect that Democratic congressional candidates and gubernatorial candidates are going to do better than Joe Biden. But Joe Biden sets the bar so low because there's so little enthusiasm for him that doesn't surprise me at all. And it wouldn't shock me in the least if we somehow ended up with a Democratic Congress and Donald Trump as president. I could totally see that outcome.
And that would not be fun for anybody.
No. Yeah. Well, I guess it would be good for podcasters and political media, but for the country as a whole, yeah, not exactly the result, I think anyone would want. So, we're at that point, but there's so many things we haven't gotten to, like, for instance, the House holding Merrick Garland in contempt and a bunch of things about Pride Month that Miss Rachel, who I hadn't heard of, but who's apparently a big deal. I want to talk about that and a lot of other sort of, I think, relevant and important cultural type of things. And we are going to get to that on the midweek show. So we hope you will check that out. But for now, if there's anything that May and I talked about that you disagreed with, I'm sure there's a lot, or if you have just a question, or even if you just want to say, I really like that, we'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch with us an email. We're mail@politicsguys.com. There's also Facebook or X. Links are always in the show notes. And then there's our Discord discussion forum for supporters. I'm on that all the time. And if you're not already a supporter, we hope you'll consider becoming one because you get that Discord access. You get ad-free versions of what we put out. It's a good thing, and it helps us keep on doing what we're doing. So we'd really appreciate that. And you can find the links there in the show notes. And if you don't like Patreon for whatever reason, there's Venmo, there's PayPal. You can just, send us bundles of cash in the mail. We'll take whatever. We're happy to take any of that. So thank you so much. And as always, a very special thanks to our fantastic executive producers. They are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,